I am going to step into the role of a seasoned traveler, a researcher, and someone who has spent years watching how laws actually play out on the ground. This is going to be a long, deep, opinionated, and conversational breakdown of what I'm seeing in this Minnesota bill. I will make sure it flows naturally, keeps you on the edge of your seat, and feels like we're just sitting down having a serious conversation. I want you to stop whatever you're doing right now and really think about this. Imagine it's 3 in the morning, you're sound asleep, and suddenly there's a loud knock at your door. You stumble out of bed, and when you open the door, it's a local police officer who tells you they're here to do a routine inspection of your firearm storage. They don't have a warrant. They don't have a probable cause. They just have a new law that says they have the right to come in and look. What would you do? Would you step aside and let them in, or would you tell them no? I am dead serious here. I want you to think about that gut reaction, and I definitely want you to drop that answer in the comments. Because the way you answer that question tells me everything about how you view your rights. And more importantly, it tells me whether you've been paying attention to how quickly the ground can shift under our feet when it comes to the Second Amendment. I am going to give you the full breakdown of what is actually in this bill, but I need you to hold on to that answer, because by the time you finish reading this, you might realize that the choice you think you have in that moment might not exist at all. This isn't just some abstract political debate happening in a faraway state capital. This is a living, breathing piece of legislation that cuts to the very core of what we think of as private property and personal sovereignty. We are talking about Minnesota Senate File 4290. Now, I have been watching the evolution of gun laws in this country for decades, both from the perspective of a researcher who digs into the legal language and as someone who travels constantly and sees how these laws create invisible boundaries. And I have to tell you, when I first read the summary of SF 4290, I actually had to read it twice because I thought I was missing something. I thought maybe the reporting was sensationalizing it. But no, the more I dug into the text and the commentary from legal experts, the more I realized that this bill represents something we haven't really seen before in the modern gun control debate. Most people, when they hear about a new gun bill, they think it's about background checks, or raising the age to buy a rifle, or maybe banning a specific stock or grip. That's the usual noise. But SF 4290 takes a hard left turn into territory that should concern every single American, regardless of whether you own 50 guns or you've never touched one in your life. Because this bill isn't just about the hardware, it's about the sanctity of the 4 walls you live inside. Let's break down exactly what this legislation proposes, because the details here are where the real weight lies. State Senator Matt Klein introduced this bill, and on its face, it looks like another attempt to ban what they call semi-automatic military-style assault weapons. We've seen this playbook before. We've seen it in Illinois, we've seen attempts in Virginia, and we see it popping up in various forms across the country. Usually these bills die on the vine, or they get passed and immediately tied up in court for a decade. But what makes Minnesota different this time is the enforcement mechanism. It's not just a ban, it's a registry combined with a warrantless home inspection. Now pay close attention here because this is where the language gets tricky. The bill essentially says that if you currently own one of these rifles, you can keep it. You are grandfathered in. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, right? The politicians stand up and say, "We don't want to take your guns away, we just want to make sure we stop future sales." That's the soundbite. But the fine print is where the devil is doing jumping jacks. To keep that rifle, you don't just get to keep it. You have to jump through a very specific set of hoops. You have to obtain a state-issued certificate of ownership. That in itself is a registry, plain and simple. But then, the bill explicitly states that you must agree to allow the appropriate law enforcement agency to inspect the storage of the device to ensure compliance with this subdivision. Let me translate that legal speak into plain English for you. It means that the state of Minnesota is proposing a system where, if you want to exercise what the Supreme Court has recognized as an individual right, you have to sign a waiver that lets the police come into your home whenever they deem it necessary to check your safe, your closet, or your gun cabinet. They don't need a judge to sign off on it. They don't need to suspect you of a crime. They just need this piece of paper you signed to gain access to the interior of your private residence. I want you to sit with that for a second. Think about the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. You know, the one that talks about the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. That amendment was written by people who had living memory of British soldiers using writs of assistance to barge into colonial homes whenever they felt like it. They considered that protection so fundamental that they put it right up there with freedom of speech and religion. And yet, here we are, looking at a bill that asks you to voluntarily waive that right as the price of keeping a piece of property you already legally own. I've spent a lot of time in places where you have to deal with authority just to exist. Traveling through countries with heavy-handed governments teaches you something about the value of privacy. You realize that the moment the state has the power to enter your home without warning, the concept of home changes. It stops being a castle and starts being a temporary shelter that the government lets you use. That's the slippery slope that keeps me up at night. And I'm not just talking about the guns here. I'm talking about the principle. If the state can come in to check your gun safe, what stops them from expanding that authority later? What stops the next bill from saying, well, if we can check the safe, we need to check the kitchen for trans fats, or we need to check the medicine cabinet for expired prescriptions? You have to look at the architecture of the law, not just the current target. The supporters of this bill, like Senator Ron Latz, who was part of the Gun Violence Prevention Working Group, frame this as a public health issue. They use statistics about the number of deaths per year, and they talk about keeping firearms out of the hands of people who would misuse them. And look, I get it. I am not here to tell you that violence isn't a problem. I travel through enough cities to see the impact of crime. But we have to be intellectually honest about what we're doing. If the goal was truly to prevent accidents or theft, you could focus on education. You could incentivize safe storage with tax breaks. You could do 100 different things that don't involve a police officer standing in your living room. This feels different. This feels like a way to make ownership so burdensome, so invasive, that people just give up. Brian Strawser, the chairman of the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, pointed out exactly this dynamic. He highlighted that not only do you have to let the cops in, but you also lose the ability to carry magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, and you are essentially confined to possessing those firearms only in your home. So, if you have a cabin up north, or if you want to take it to a range that's out of state, you might be running into a whole new set of legal problems. They are creating a web of regulations that is so sticky that the average person will either get caught in it or just decide it's not worth the hassle. And let's talk about that hassle for a minute, because I want to get practical here. This is where my travel experience and my understanding of human behavior comes into play. Imagine you're a law-abiding citizen. You work hard, you pay your taxes, and you have a nice collection of rifles that you use for sport and protection. You go through the process, you get your certificate, and you think you're good. Then one day, you're at work and your spouse calls you. There's a police officer at the door. He's doing compliance checks in the neighborhood. He wants to see the safe. What happens next? If your spouse is flustered, if they don't know the exact wording of the law, they might let the officer in out of fear or confusion. Now, you have a cop inside your house looking around. Is he only looking at the safe? Or is he looking at the stack of mail on the counter? Is he noticing the smell of marijuana from last night? Is he seeing the unregistered boat in the driveway that might be linked to a tax issue? Once you waive your Fourth Amendment rights, you waive them entirely for that encounter. Anything the officer sees in plain view can be used against you. That's the legal doctrine. So a simple gun check could spiral into an investigation into your life based on absolutely nothing. I've written about airport security for years, and the same principle applies there. When you step into that line, you are consenting to a search. They don't need a warrant because you consented by buying a ticket. But what happens when that model of consent gets pulled out of the airport and planted in your neighborhood? That's what SF 4290 does. It turns your home into a jurisdiction where you have to consent to inspection as a condition of exercising a right. That is a constitutional earthquake. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, the Supreme Court will just strike this down. And you might be right. There are strong precedents like Heller and Bruin that protect the rights of law-abiding citizens. But here is the thing about the courts that I've learned from years of research. They are slow. They are reactive, not proactive. And in the meantime, while the legal challenges are winding their way through the district courts and the appellate courts, people are living under this law. People are having their doors knocked on. People are having to make that split-second decision about whether to assert their rights or cooperate. The legal victory, if it comes 5 years later, doesn't erase that moment of fear and intrusion. There is also a massive logistical question here that nobody seems to be talking about. How many homes are we talking about? We know that as of 2022, there were over 490 million guns in private hands in America, and the AR-15 platform is one of the most popular, accounting for roughly 1 in every 5 new firearm sales. If even a fraction of those owners in Minnesota decide to keep their firearms under this grandfather clause, you are looking at hundreds of thousands of inspections. Where are the police departments going to find the manpower to do this? Are they going to create a special gun storage inspection unit? Are they going to pull officers off of responding to 911 calls to go look in people's closets? It doesn't make sense from a practical standpoint unless the goal is simply to make the process so unwieldy that the system collapses under its own weight, or to use the threat of inspection as a tool for harassment. And let's not ignore the political context here. We are seeing similar pushes in other states. Virginia, under new leadership, is careening in a similar direction. This isn't an isolated incident in the frozen north. It looks like a coordinated effort to test the waters. They are testing to see if the public will accept the premise that ownership requires state-supervised storage. If Minnesota succeeds, you can bet your bottom dollar that similar bills will appear in other state legislatures. They will copy and paste the language, and suddenly the Minnesota model becomes the national template. I think about the history of these things. I think about how the government in the UK started requiring licensing for firearms. Then it became licensing for certain knives. Then it became restrictions on anything that could be used as a weapon. It's a slow boil. You never notice the temperature rising until you're fully cooked. That's why this bill is so important to watch. It's not just about the rifles. It's about the introduction of the home inspection as a standard regulatory tool. There is also a psychological warfare aspect to this. Knowing that the state has the legal authority to enter your home at any time to check your stuff changes how you feel in your own space. You might start keeping your blinds closed tighter. You might start worrying every time a car with bright headlights pulls into your driveway at night. You might second-guess every purchase you make. That constant low-level anxiety is a tax on your freedom. It's a cost that doesn't show up on a receipt, but you pay it every day. I have stood in customs lines in countries where you have to declare everything, where they can search your bags based on a whim. And you know what you do in those lines? You shrink. You become smaller. You try to be invisible. You hope they don't pick you. That is the exact opposite of how a citizen should feel in their own country. A citizen should feel sovereign. A citizen should feel that their home is their refuge. This bill erodes that feeling at a fundamental level. The other thing that gets me about this is the targeting. It specifically targets semi-automatic military-style assault weapons. That term itself is a marketing invention. It sounds scary, but functionally, semi-automatic means you pull the trigger once, it fires once. That describes the vast majority of firearms sold in America today, from .22 caliber plinking rifles to hunting shotguns. By using that language, they cast a wide net. But then they apply the most invasive inspection requirement only to those who own the scary ones. It's a divide-and-conquer strategy. They hope that the guy with the hunting bolt action will say, well, that doesn't affect me, let them check the AR guys. But once the principle of warrantless checks is established for one class of weapon, what stops them from expanding the definition of military style next year? It could be based on caliber, based on magazine location, based on color. The standard is whatever the legislature decides it is. I've been in this game long enough to know that most people don't pay attention until the knock comes on their own door. That's human nature. We think it's always someone else's problem. But if you are reading this and you live in the United States, this is your problem. Because this isn't a Minnesota problem. This is a precedent problem. If the Constitution can be circumvented in Minnesota by framing a search as a voluntary condition of ownership, it can be done anywhere. Think back to that question I asked you at the very beginning. The knock at the door in the middle of the night. Would you open it? If you said yes, you have to ask yourself why. Is it because you trust the officer? Maybe you do. Maybe you know him personally. But the law isn't about that specific officer. It's about the system. It's about the next officer, the one you don't know, the one who has had a bad day, the one who might have a grudge against someone who looks like you. The law has to protect you from the worst-case scenario, not just accommodate the best-case scenario. If you said no, you wouldn't open the door, then you have to think about the consequences. Under SF 4290, if you say no, you might be in violation of the terms of your certificate. You might lose your right to possess that firearm. You might be charged with a crime. So you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. You can assert your constitutional right against unreasonable searches and lose your statutory right to own that rifle. That's the trap. They've built a box where the only way out is to give up your property or give up your privacy. I've seen this kind of thing in the context of travel, with things like global entry. You give up your right to a border search in exchange for expedited processing. That's a choice. You don't have to join global entry. You can wait in the regular line. But here, if you already own the gun, You don't have a regular line option. The only option to keep it is to sign up for the invasive search program. That's not a choice, that's coercion. The introduction of this bill, SF 4290, is just the first step. It's been referred to the Judiciary and Public Safety Committee, but no hearing has been scheduled yet. That means there is still time. There is still time for the public to weigh in, for the debate to happen, for the light to shine on these dark corners of the legislation. But it requires attention. It requires people to actually read the text and not just trust the headlines that say bill to ban assault weapons. This is where I come back to the researcher in me. I love digging into the text. I love finding the hidden clauses that the media glosses over. And in this case, the inspection clause is the headline, but the registry is the backbone. A registry is a list. Lists can be leaked, lists can be hacked, lists can be used for future confiscation efforts. History is littered with examples of registration leading to confiscation. It's the easiest way to find out who has what. So even if the inspections never happen, the registry is a dangerous tool in and of itself. And what happens if you move? What happens if you are a legal owner in Minnesota with a certificate and you have to relocate for a job to Wisconsin? Can you take your rifle? Can you transport it across state lines? The bill creates a permanent tie between you and the state of Minnesota. It anchors you there. That is a restriction on your freedom of movement, which is another fundamental right. You might be trapped in a state you want to leave, because leaving means leaving your property behind or making yourself a felon. I've moved a lot in my life. I've packed up and shipped my life across oceans. The idea that a state law could handcuff me to a specific zip code because of a piece of metal and plastic is infuriating. It's not just about guns, it's about mobility. It's about the freedom to pick up and start over somewhere else without the government putting a lien on your rights. Let me also touch on the enforcement mechanism. Who pays for these inspections? The taxpayers. So the state bans something, then creates a massive bureaucratic infrastructure to manage the people who owned it before the ban, and then makes the public pay for the officer's time to go door to door. It's fiscally irresponsible on top of being constitutionally dubious. In an era where we are told there's no money for schools, no money for roads, suddenly there's money for a gun storage inspection task force. It doesn't add up unless the goal is something other than safety. I believe in personal responsibility. I believe that if you own a gun, you should store it safely, especially if there are kids in the house. I've said that for years. But there is a massive difference between encouraging safe storage through education and forcing compliance through warrantless police entries. One builds a culture of responsibility. The other builds a culture of suspicion. One treats you like an adult. The other treats you like a potential criminal. This bill treats every grandfathered gun owner like a potential criminal. It assumes that unless the police physically come into your house and see the safe, you are probably doing it wrong. That is a poisonous assumption. It destroys trust between the community and law enforcement. It turns the police from protectors into inspectors. It changes the dynamic of every interaction. I've talked to cops before, during my travels and research. Most of them don't want this. They don't want to be the gun police. They have enough on their plates dealing with actual violent crime. They don't want to be knocking on doors of law-abiding citizens to check if their gun safe is locked. It's a recipe for conflict. It puts the officer in a dangerous position too. Walking up to a house unannounced to ask about guns is a high-tension situation. It's unnecessary risk for everyone involved. So where does that leave us? It leaves us watching. It leaves us talking. It leaves us asking the hard questions. This bill, SF 4290, is a shot across the bow. It's a test. And how we react to it, how we talk about it, how we educate our neighbors about it, will determine whether this becomes a trend or an isolated overreach that gets shot down. I want to circle back to that original question because it's the core of this whole discussion. The knock on the door, the officer asking to see your guns. In the world of SF 4290, that officer has the full weight of state law behind him. He's not trespassing. He's conducting an administrative inspection that you agreed to in writing when you registered your rifle. The question isn't just about what you would do emotionally. It's about what you would do legally. And in that moment, you might find that the law has backed you into a corner where there is no good option. That is why we have to look at laws before they pass. We have to look at them with a critical eye and imagine how they would actually play out on a Tuesday afternoon. We have to think about the unintended consequences, the slippery slopes, and the erosion of principles that took centuries to build. I've seen a lot of laws come and go. I've seen the travel industry change. I've seen security theater at airports. I've seen the gradual acceptance of surveillance. And every time the argument is the same. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. But that argument fundamentally misunderstands what it means to be free. It's not about hiding something. It's about the presumption that the state should have to justify its intrusion into your life. It's about making the government prove that it needs to see inside your house, not you proving that you deserve to be left alone. This bill flips that presumption on its head. It says that if you want to own a certain type of property, you must prove to the government on demand and in your home that you are worthy. That is not the American way. At least it wasn't. So as you go about your day, as you watch the news, as you hear the talking heads debate this bill, remember the specifics, remember the inspection clause, remember the registry, and remember that feeling of that knock on the door at 3 a.m. Because that feeling, that unease, is the price of admission under this new system. The question is, are you willing to pay it? I'm not. I don't think you should be either. But that's just my opinion, based on a lifetime of watching how power works. I want to know what you think. I want to know if you trust your local police department enough to let them walk through your living room without a warrant. I want to know if you think a certificate from the state is worth trading your privacy for. Drop that comment below. Tell me where you stand. Because this conversation is just getting started, and the more voices we have in it, the harder it is for anyone to sneak laws like this through while we aren't looking. Keep your eyes open. Know your rights, and never forget that the home is the one place where you are supposed to be the final authority. Once you give that up, it's very hard to get it back. This response is AI generated, for reference only.